I will speak English and start with a couple of questions, try to convey the most important of them. So I would, at the beginning, combine two that are the second and the third one, which go like that. How to talk to people about meaningful things, but to people that do not care about freedom and truth. And there's another one, how to deal with radical left ideology. Probably those two have something in common. I'm just saying.
Well, I would say first that the best way to talk is through example. I mean, first of all, there'll be people that you can't talk to. And you can tell when you're talking to people that you can't talk to because they don't listen. In which case, you're not actually talking to them. You're talking to a set of preconceived notions that they're clinging to desperately that they will not alter under any circumstances. And it's generally the case that ceasing a conversation like that is often your best strategic bet. But having said that, if it's a matter of convincing, then the most convincing action is actually action. I mean, the way to move people towards respect for freedom and responsibility is to manifest your commitment to both of those through action and to demonstrate that in the confines of your own life that actually works. And it does work. And so it's a pretty powerful argument. I think the best way to convince people is not so much to challenge what they believe, because that can make them more resistant and rigid, but to show or tell a better story. And it is the case that it's one of the things I learned as a clinical psychologist. I mean, not only that, but that many times in life people don't get what they want and they need because they don't aim at it. And it's a hard lesson for people to learn because they're cynical to begin with and they presume that there's no possible way of moving forward. But it's not so unreasonable to assume that you're not going to hit what you don't aim at, or you're not going to hit what you aim at and don't shoot at. And I've seen time and time again that if people do put forward a vision for what they regard as worthy of pursuit, which is something you have to determine in dialogue with yourself. It's like, given the difficult preconditions of existence, is there anything that you could conceive of that you would regard as sufficiently worthwhile so that you would be motivated to pursue it? It's a profound philosophical question, and it's not an unreasonable one. It's a good place to start. It's like, well, life is difficult enough to make you cynical and bitter, and perhaps enough to make you cynical and bitter and suicidal and homicidal and even genocidal. And it's not surprising in some sense. And then the question is, well, is there something that you can pursue that allows that to be acceptable or perhaps even desirable, which is something to do that justifies the suffering? And it's hard to say what that would be for each of you. It's something that you can discover. This is partly why Nietzsche was wrong. Nietzsche thought that after God had died, that human beings would have to invent their own values. But the psychoanalysts, I would say Jung foremost among them, put forward a very powerful counterclaim, which was that, well, you can't invent values. They're already built into you. You have to discover them. And I think that's true for each person. It's like, well, what would justify you in the abandonment of your resentment and hostility? What would be a sufficiently adventurous goal? And this is part of the problem with the collectivist viewpoint, I believe. I was thinking about that today too. You know, I learned as a psychotherapist not to solve my clients' problems for them. You're a bad therapist if you offer advice. I mean, you do sometimes, because there are situations that are relatively trivial that just need to be strategized through. But fundamentally, what you want to do, if you're careful, as a friend or a family member or as a psychotherapist, is to help the person discover their own pathway forward, right? And that's going to be a difficult pathway, because it means that they're going to have to accept the burden of their life. And then they're going to have to come up with their own solutions to what would justify that burden. And if they come up with their own solutions, then often they find one that at least in part justifies the burden. And the problem with the collectivist perspective, especially the one that portrays you as a victim, is that it's always up to someone else to solve your problems. It's not like you don't have the problems. You know, the idea that in some sense you're an eternal victim, well, there's a truth in that, given that nature is conspiring to destroy you and will be successful in the end, that you're undermined by your own society at the same time you're buttressed by it, and that you're a target of your own malevolence and that of others. I mean, so there's a triad of tragic and malevolent forces that are aimed directly at your heart, and that's always the case. But to not take responsibility for that and to attribute to that to a cosmic injustice or a sociological injustice in some sense that's aimed particularly at you, that's somehow the fault of others, is to miss the great adventure of your life. You know, one of the things I learned last year, I was doing a series of biblical lectures, and I started to analyze the Abrahamic stories, which I didn't know very well. And the story of Abraham is particularly interesting because Abraham he's a slow starter. He's one of those guys that failed to launch, right? He's in his father's tent, hanging around his mother's skirts till he's 80. And 80, that's exactly it. And God finally gets fed up with him and says, look, why don't you get the hell out of the tent and get out there in the world and have an adventure? You know, your life is waiting for you. And well, it's God calling, so Abraham has enough sense to pack up and leave, but it's complete bloody catastrophe from there on in, you know. I mean, the first thing he encounters is a famine, and that's no joke, and then it's a tyranny, that's the next thing, and then it's a conspiracy to steal his wife. And I'm sure that he spent the next 20 years wondering why in the world he ever listened to God and just didn't stay in his damn tent. You know, but there's the Abrahamic story and the stories that follow that they all have that same narrative structure, is that there's this call to adventure, but it's not to happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's to a heroic mode of being that involves taking responsibility for the full catastrophe, and that in that adoption of that adventurous mode of being, there's a deep meaning to be found. Right, a meaning maybe that transcends just you, that involves your family and that involves your community and maybe even the destiny of humanity itself. But there's nothing about that that's secure or easy, and very little that has to do with happiness. The idea that your problems should be solved for you, let's say, and that it's unfair that you have them, well, it's attractive in that there's nothing for you to do except complain, but it's horrifying in that there's nothing for you to do except complain. The difficulty is actually, the funny thing is the difficulty is actually the destiny. And it is insanely difficult, but maybe you're insanely up to the task. You know, and I would also say, there is evidence for this, you know, in the clinical literature. We know that one of the main strategies that you can use to help people cure themselves is for them to grapple with what they're terrified by. Grapple with what they're terrified so badly that they're avoiding. And to learn to confront it in pieces, in stages, in manageable stages. Not too much, you know, because you can hurt yourself. But not too little, because then it's pointless. And it works. It makes people not less vulnerable, but more courageous and stronger, which is better than being less vulnerable, because good luck with that. That's not happening. But you can be more courageous and you can be stronger. And And if you take on the burden of confronting the catastrophe of your existence, then that happens. And it actually works. And that's part of what everyone is called upon to discover in their life, and partly what religious stories try to remind people of, in some sense, to wake them up, say, you're more than you think you are. And this is another thing I realized on this tour, actually. I hadn't conceptualized this properly before. There's this old idea that the hero rescues his father from the abyss, or from the belly of a great monster, the dead father. You see that reflected in stories like Pinocchio in the Disney movie, because the puppet rescues Geppetto from the belly of a whale, the most terrifying possible place at the bottom of the lowest possible abyss. And what that means is this, is that if you stare, and this is the answer to the Nietzschean dilemma. Nietzsche said, beware of staring. If you look long into an abyss, then the abyss looks into you. Well, if you look long enough into an abyss, then you discover something at the bottom of it. And what you discover at the bottom of it is your dead father. And what that means is that if you look at what terrifies you forthrightly enough, then you discover the spirit of your ancestors that you could become. And that won't be called out of you without that courageous confrontation. Because nothing is called out of you without it being demanded. It's the same as working out in a gym. You lift heavy weights, not so heavy that they hurt you, but heavy enough so that they're slightly beyond your capacity to grasp. Nothing is compelled out of you without necessity. And so then you ask, well, what if you subject yourself to the highest possible level of necessity? Maybe then the possibility is that the best there is called forth out of you. And that's a union with all the great. That's the union with what's greatest about humanity in the past, because that's in you. But it's not going to come out without compulsion, and the compulsion that you set upon yourself. And so that's the antidote to the collectivist viewpoint. It's like, it's your problem, and thank God for that. Because you need a problem to justify your miserable existence. And it has to be a problem of sufficient magnitude so that you can look yourself in the mirror when you wake up in the morning and you can think, well, despite my inadequacy and all the things about me that are insufficient, at least I'm bearing up under this worthwhile load. And that's a start. So,
thank you.